My name is James Lenup with Ehlers and Associates, the city's financial advisor, and was deeply involved in the financial analysis and TIF preparation for this project. As was noted, there are two actions before you tonight. We'll cover those, but I also just wanted to, again, cover just a little bit of information, a few of the key components related to TIF, a few of the important numbers related to this project, and then ultimately a couple items related to the TIF plans that are before you tonight. Since not everyone has the exciting opportunity to look at tax increment financing at every single meeting like I often get to in many different communities, I do think it's helpful to actually start with just a kind of a distilled down definition of TIF. And up on the screen here, it is the ability to capture and use most, no, not all, most of the increased local property tax revenues from new development within a defined geographic area. Before we pull those apart, it's always important to recognize that when a city starts down a path of considering any type of public assistance, TIF in this case, the first and most important question is looking at the developer's pro forma and their request to go, is there a need for any assistance at all? And if there is a need for assistance, what is the level of assistance that is warranted to make it financially feasible? What's that minimum amount needed to actually get a project over the finish line? And that's something that we do with every single project that gets looked at for financial assistance. And over the last several months, and really even longer than that, we worked with city staff and the developer to pull apart their pro forma in every which way possible. I'm sure Steve here with the development side can attest to that part of it. Put it back together to see what is ultimately needed. And that is what culminated in the HRA's work in approving the development agreement for just under $8.5 million. And I think I saw a look up at the dais when there was a reference to a $25 million number, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. So that was previously approved by the HRA tonight, and tonight is really the last step in the TIF process. When we look at TIF, there are many different nuances and a lot of fun language in state statutes, but it really comes down to a few key components related to that definition. Now, any property that's out there has a value assigned to it, and property taxes are calculated off of that base value. That is the case with this project, of course, as well, and that's that original tax capacity. And that value, even once you add on a new project and add more value to the project, to the property, that base value, those taxes still get paid to the city, the county, the school district, and so on. That is not captured as part of the TIF. It's a common belief that when there's TIF on a property, everything goes back to a project. That's not the case. There's still some that is withheld in that. And it's only that new or captured portion of that new value where some of that becomes available for the potential TIF assistance. And just as importantly, it's only available for a certain period of time. Statutes limit us, specifically in a housing TIF district that we're discussing tonight, to no more than 26 years. Some districts are shorter because not every project actually needs 26 years of assistance. But in this very simple graph up here, it's showing over time that there's a captured portion that can help in TIF. There's a base portion that is still paid to all the local jurisdictions, and at some point that all ends. The TIF does not go on forever. The TIF assistance does not, and when that TIF district ends, what is paid in property taxes goes to all the local taxing jurisdictions, now on a hopefully still much higher value because it's a much bigger project. Now, as I alluded to, there are some portions of that that are not captured in the TIF. There's those base value taxes that I just talked about. When it's a commercial property, or if you happen to have a cabin, it is subject to state property taxes. Those are always taken out when it's a commercial property. And then there's market value taxes, which is how we describe essentially voter-approved school referendums. So that part is also excluded from the TIF calculations. And in fact, it is calculated on the higher value. So those voter-approved school referendums benefit from the higher property value when calculating those taxes. As I mentioned, we are looking at a housing TIF district tonight where the maximum possible term is 26 years. And one of the key parts of a housing TIF district is it does have an affordability requirement associated with that, which the developer has agreed to in the pro forma and must maintain throughout the life of the TIF district in order to continually to get that assistance in the future. There's two options that a development can choose within a housing TIF district, and one of those is that 20% of the apartments can be affordable at 50% of area median income, or 40% of the apartments can be affordable at 60% of area median income. What that means in real life numbers, also up on the screen there, is that if you're a household of one, they must reserve 20% of the apartments for households earning about $31,000, almost $32,000 a year, all the way up to households of four, to 45,000, and that's adjusted based on household size. I just showed household sizes of 1 through 4 on the screen here. There's also limitations in statutes on how assistance can be spent. We don't get to do just anything with it. In this case, it can be used on items related for construction of the affordable housing, land acquisition, no demolition associated with this project anymore, site improvements, and so on. Ineligible uses don't really apply in this, but it's good to always note that with TIF, you can never pay for recreation-related items like city parks or other city buildings. TIF is only for to assist private redevelopment. For the project specifically for you tonight related to this TIF proposal, it is the 316 mixed income apartments proposed by the developer, most of which is new construction. A part of that is rehab. We talked about the affordability component and the previously approved development agreement that has already gone through the HRA process. One thing that I think is always important to talk about, since again, not everybody's familiar with all aspects of TIF, what Richfield does and what most communities do, it is pay-as-you-go TIF. And the key part of that is that none of that assistance is provided upfront to the developer. Only once the project is done and only once they start paying the new higher property taxes does then, over a period of time, assistance become available. There is no upfront assistance associated with a project like this. It is pay as you go. So they have to show higher value before they can benefit from any potential assistance. Now, I've committed a cardinal rule against PowerPoints by showing very tiny numbers up in the PowerPoint, but there's just a couple things that I want to draw your attention to that I think are important for this project. I'm happy to go back and answer any questions, though, of course, about this and any other items. Now, as I mentioned, those base value taxes, those still get paid to the local taxing jurisdiction, are not captured in TIF. But what's a little bit unique here is that most of the property has actually been owned by the city for a number of years, and when it's owned by the city, it doesn't pay any local property taxes. And this actually pulling numbers from this project right now, those existing properties and the Richfield owned properties, the value is just under, or it would produce a value of just under $2.6 million. Now, reality is that although that property is owned by the city and doesn't actually pay taxes today, it does certainly have value. And in fact, when we look at it for TIF purposes, we work with the county assessor and they assign a value to that property as though it had been paying property taxes. And what that means here is that $2.6 million value increases to about $5.1 million. And it's off of that number, and if we would look at this year's numbers, it would calculate those local property taxes. So actually starting from the beginning, the amount of taxes that are potentially generated by the base value of the property go up immediately as soon as it is sold to the developer. That does not get included in that TIF. And I think that's an important part of this project. These numbers up on the screen, if you really dive into it, are based on pay 2017 tax rates. Of course, we know over time that will continue to get adjusted. What gets really exciting with TIF and where we had that potential for assistance is that we look at, when it's all said and done, a value of almost $44 million on the property, and it's off that incremental higher value. We find the opportunity for TIF assistance, and if I can draw your attention into that lower right-hand corner where one of the arrows is at, that based off that value and the pay 2017 property tax rates, it would generate a tax bill of about $826,000. And when we distill that down to what is actually available for TIF, we take out those base value taxes, we take out the state auditor's fees because they take a little bit, and the city's administrative fee. Again, based on the rates this year, that would produce an annual potential TIF of $610,000, or about 74 cents on each property tax dollar paid. I just covered a lot of numbers really quick there, and I'm happy to go back to look at any of those. Now, the actions before you tonight, there are two components to that. The first one, it was noted in the introduction, is modifying that existing Cedar Avenue TIF district to remove the 31 parcels. There's also another component that extends the duration of that district by 10 years, which is the result of some recent special legislation the city received, so it's more of a technical item. That does require a public hearing before taking action. And then the second item is creating the housing TIF district for the Chamberlain project. Earlier I mentioned that I would come back to that $25 million number, but we're talking about $8.5 million of assistance. That $25 million number includes a couple different components, specifically inflation over time. It's meant to provide maximum possible budgetary flexibility to the city. That $25 million does not in any form represent assistance to the developer. It's a TIF calculation for the city's use related to the TIF district. This action also requires a public hearing, and as we noted, the development agreement was previously approved. We would ask that you take these actions separately tonight. We have put the resolution language up on the screen for your use. And again, it does require a public hearing before taking any action. So with that, covering a lot of small details and some of the big ones, I'm happy to stand for any questions.